So welcome to CYP Now's big debate on children's residential care to coincide with our residential care special report in the October edition of the magazine. Today we will be discussing or answering the question, will the introduction of registration for supported accommodation providers improve standards of children's residential care? So I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Kerr, Deputy CEO of the Children's Home Association, Rebekah Pierre, Professional Officer at BASWA, the British Association of Social Workers, and Alex Garvin, Director of ILEA Palm Care. My name is Derren Hayes. I'm the editor of CYP Now. I'll be overseeing discussions, and we hope that it will be an interesting and stimulating debate. As way of introduction, from the 26th of October this year, providers of supported accommodation will need to be registered with Ofsted to be able to offer placements to 16 and 17-year-olds in local authority care. The requirement was one of the measures announced by the government following the care review, although it stopped short of an outright ban on such provision for all under 18s, as called for by some campaigners. Alongside registration and inspection by Ofsted, providers will also need to meet new quality standards introduced at the same time, though these are less stringent than those used for standard children's homes. Ministers have said that all the changes are aimed at improving standards of placements and in turn outcomes for children. But some sector experts have warned that the changes could prompt existing supported accommodation providers to close settings and thus reducing capacity further. So the first question I wanted to pose to our panel: will registration or regulation deliver the improvements promised or needed? It's a big question to start with. Mark, over to you.
So my opinion, in the short term, no, I don't think the kind of intended outcomes are going to be achieved, because the environment and the current system pressures that are affecting all forms of care, residential, regulated children's homes, foster care, and now kind of the new kind of 16 plus provision. We have a kind of recruitment crisis that's very endemic, and it's paralysed the whole sector. So, you know, for policies to be successful, you really need to ensure that they are implemented at a time where they're going to have the most chances of success. We have been kind of making calls to government to support sector-led recruitment campaigns that we've done with sort of residential childcare careers, but there's been no support to date, despite a wealth of support offered to foster care, £20 million to support recruitment there. Significant money being given to adult social care. So recruitment's a massive issue. But if we look at the under 16s, for example, that was banned and made illegal, up and down the country, local authorities are still having to use their unregulated, unregistered provision for under 16. So that hasn't been a magic bullet, because whichever way you look at it, there are not enough regulated children's homes. I'm, you know, as a care experienced person and kind of child-centered professional, I'm all for raising standards and improving outcomes, but it takes more than a simple regulation. And my fear is that there's going to be unintended consequences for this, because of the impact on local authorities' sufficiency as it stands. So I think in the short term, no, because the environmental conditions at the moment, there's just too many pressures in the system. Longer term, I hope so.
Do you think that it might have perhaps been beneficial if it was a more phased introduction of this type of measure, because you're kind of suggesting that it's possibly the right direction in the medium term, but in the short term, it's not realistic to be able to achieve?
I think there needed to be a really good review of what the barriers were going to be to implementing it, and to make sure you address the barriers. There's 2 or 3 very high level ones. Recruitment, I've mentioned. Planning consents is others. And unfortunately, the responsibility is now kind of put over to the providers themselves, the local authorities and Ofsted, and the government kind of step away. So I think they needed to kind of really do a good assessment of what was going to, you know, be a barrier to achieving this, and that hasn't been done. We don't even know enough about the kids that are in unregulated. The only information we've got is from the Nuffield Foundation's work, which highlights that there are a lot of kids there that will not be able to be there post the end of next month, let's say. So we just don't know what the profile of child or young person is, what we're looking at, what their needs are, what their risks are. So we're kind of flying in the dark as a sector at the moment in terms of trying to ensure that we step up to meet these regulations.
Does anyone know if we're talking hundreds or thousands of children? I think it'd be hundreds, I presume, for under 16s that obviously won't be there anymore. But I mean, we're talking in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds. Do we know roughly how many young people are in those placements?
Yeah, there are currently just over 7,000, although that's set to increase.
Gotcha. 16 and 17-year-olds, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Rebekah, if I could bring you in there, thank you for that. I think I'm right in saying that you have supported the ban for all under 18s of such provision. Do you think that what the current arrangements or the rearrangements that are going to be coming into force shortly, despite not being ideal, will actually improve standards? Are you hopeful that there will see an improvement in the quality of provision as a result?
My answer is very simply no, and I speak both as someone who lived in a unregulated, now referred to as careless accommodation myself at that age. Also, my background is child protection, social work, and I can hand on heart say I have never ever met a 16 or 17-year-old who, despite how streetwise they may present, are realistically capable of keeping themselves safe. I mean, if we look at the last 10 years, the Times just shared that up to the decade of 2021, 50 children died in unregulated accommodation. Many of those deaths were preventable. The risks are clear. We know that children in these settings are more likely to experience child sexual abuse, poor mental health, go missing. I think that one statistic that stood out to me was 30% of children in these settings go missing, and that's compared to 12% who aren't, so almost 3 times as much. County lines is a significant issue in this area, and I know that firsthand because within 5 minutes of entering my unregulated accommodation, someone said to me, if you want any green, you know where I am. So drugs are readily available in these areas. If we look at serious case reviews involving children, there have been preventable deaths, particularly where there's been a low level of adult supervision, and children have died because simply they've not had access to medication or regular medical reviews. I mean, when we're talking about delivering improvements needed, I think we need to be clear on what those improvements are to begin with. And it's clear to me that the government standards of what is good enough or acceptable is nowhere near what many of us in the sector feel. So the fact that caravans, adult homeless hostels are presented as feasible options or as safe options, to me is nowhere near good enough. I know when I lived in this setting, I was a teenage girl living with adults who had just got out of prison. It's absolutely not acceptable. I think that what the improvements do is, yes, there's improved protection to providers. And by the way, the profit margin in this area for providers is 35.5%, which is the highest across all settings, but there isn't the protection guaranteed for children and young people. And final point is that even the Children's Commissioner said that these standards aren't good enough and that they need an expiry date.
Gotcha. Mark, I'll let you respond to a few of those points in a moment. Just Rebekah, just on a couple of the points you made, but particularly around the standards. I mean, obviously, Ofsted are going to be undertaking, I think, inspections, and the new quality standards are going to be coming in, which obviously they'll be inspecting against and coming in shortly. Is it simply they just aren't robust enough? Is it that perhaps if these standards were more robust, there'd be a better chance of actually getting a better quality of care and so better outcomes for young people? Or is it just simply that, like you say, the actual kind of like the fundamentals that have supported semi-regulated or supported accommodation simply aren't fit for purpose for looked after for children in residential care?
I think it's both and to go to
Right.
your first point about inspections, one of the immediate flaws to me is that in these proposals, Ofsted will only inspect a minimum of every 3 years. That's compared to a minimum of once a year per a children's home. So I spent 20 months of my life in unregulated accommodation, which at that time felt like an eternity. And so somebody, that's an average amount of time, by the way. So somebody could have their whole, experience in unregulated without ever having outside scrutiny. I think it's also just the fundamentals of how have we got to a place in society where children in care can have less rights or less protection than adults in prison. So a child in supported accommodation isn't guaranteed to access to 3 meals a day, isn't guaranteed to 24/7 adult supervision, isn't guaranteed 24/7 access to electricity. And I know that because I would often write my A-level coursework in the dark. Those kind of conditions are completely unheard of or unthinkable in prison. So I think it's really complex, but the question is both.
No, thank you. Mark, I wonder if you want to just come back on any of the points that Rebekah made there. Particularly, I was thinking around, obviously, there's the profit motive issue there, which is obviously often has been raised a number of times in the past, but particularly by the CMA and recently by the care review, the independent care review as well. But it's also, I think, something around some of these providers will sometimes also be care home providers of children's homes, and so I don't know. Is there something there around we need to perhaps look at? I don't know, maybe kind of like making it harder to set up such provision and encouraging some of these providers to actually put those resources in setting up children's homes where to offer more options for placing these children.
There's quite a few bits to cover there.
Yeah.
In terms of, obviously, we have some members at the Children's Home Association that do operate services, 16 plus services, and I think the introduction of the regulations is going to see more open up this provision because they didn't feel safe or comfortable operating placements, often which were illegal because they had regulated provision. In terms of the profit element, I mean, much is said about profit or surplus, and a lot of it's, unfortunately, the care review is pretty disingenuous in that it regurgitated but subtly changed the findings from the CMA report, that when it looked at profit margins, it only looked at a sample of very large providers. But the care review then chose to kind of extrapolate that across the whole sector. And it was flagged to them, but they didn't correct it. So there was kind of some kind of invisible hand there trying to criticise the independent sector, when actually probably half the members of the Children's Home Association only operate 1 or 2 children's home, and their margins are very much single digit and lower single digit, some of them. So the idea that as a sector that there is widespread profiteering is absolutely wrong, and is actually doing a lot of harm to the sector because people are shutting up because they're fed up of being criticised. It's hard for recruitment. We thought long and hard at the Children's Home Association about whether or not we were going to extend our membership to those that operate supported and semi-independent provision. But the decision was that with the Children's Home Association, there were practical reasons why not, but also for several hundred providers that are not used to being heavily regulated. Whichever way, whether they don't go far enough, the transition from being totally unregulated to regulated is going to be a massive step for a lot of them. Was going to be very intensive to support them. With the same reasons we don't accept members until they're registered with Ofsted as a children's home, because of it just commercially we would not have been able to support them and resource it with staff. But there is kind of, I don't know the data that Rebekah refers to, and in terms of profit margins, because we've never had a reason to drill down into it, if I'm really honest, what the margins are. But as I say, children's homes in a regulated sector, there are only going to be very large providers that are going to be making the sort of margins that Rebekah refers to, and their costs are going to go up. Becoming regulated, the cost of delivering provision is going to go up, and subsequently, I would imagine so are the fees for local authorities at never at a worse time, really. So it is challenging.
Thank you, Mark. I was just wondering if it might be a time to bring in Alex there. Obviously, who does provide is a provider and does run a. Is it one home, Alex, or more than one?
Just one.
Just one. The description that Mark has just outlined there of the kind of scenario facing providers, is that something that you recognise in terms of, like, obviously rising costs? I apologise. I'm assuming you don't have any intention either of setting up any semi-regulated supported accommodation anytime soon.
No. I think the benefit of having children's homes is that they're called children's homes. I don't understand why supported accommodation has a different set of guidance and statutory legislation. It confuses me, because a child is 16. A child is a child, whether they're 16 or 17. So why the regulation is any different, I think there's lies the foundation of the problem. Whereas you've got people thinking that suddenly children don't need that support post 16, whereas they need more. They need more support. They need guidance through such an important period of their life, because they get to 18, despite what support might be there post 18, it's not enough, and it's practically nothing. That they're hit 18 and that's it. So they go into a supported accommodation, they finish potentially 2 years, and then they're in the big wide world with not a clue on how to support themselves, not to the detriment of them. It's not their responsibility. We're there to make sure that they're ready for when they're 18. What child that hasn't gone through the looked after system is ready at 18? I know I wasn't. I had support. So where's the support for these children, and why are they not regulated just like children's homes?
Alex, do you come across the scenarios where children are referred, or perhaps local authorities contact you with a potential referral, but children don't end up coming to you and then end up in supported accommodation? I'm not sure if you ever do any of that kind of tracking.
Yes. But I mean, had a conversation recently. Yeah.
And what's the key driver? What's the key driver behind those decision-making processes? Yeah.
Finances. That's what it is, in my view, and my view only. It's all to do with the finances. So it's obviously, at the moment, it is at least cheaper to place a child in supported accommodation. From my limited knowledge, that's how it seems to be. Now, that's all going to change. I feel that there's going to be a booming business. Sorry to speak like that and use those terms, but it will be, where providers now registering a supported accommodation will be charging a significant amount of money and open themselves up for resale to potentially larger providers. So there'll be entrepreneurs, if you call them that, that'll be starting off with maybe 1 home, 2 homes, 3 homes, and the resale value of just 3 homes, 2 homes is large for children's homes, and it will be, I suspect, quite similar in the supported accommodation. There's a lot of business people out there. They come from all different backgrounds all over the country, and unfortunately with children's homes, the business is big and you can make a lot of money, which is the opposite of what me and my business partner, who happens to be my wife, that's not what we're about. I'm the registered manager as well of the home, and I don't want to go down that road. That's not why me and my wife have done it.
Do you think there's a sorry to interrupt, I was just going to say, you think there's the changes then add an element of perhaps respectability to this kind of like that form of, maybe not respectability is not the right word, but it kind of like gives a slightly kind of like it's made as an incentive there to create that type of provision, which can then, I suppose, kind of like enhance the business case for creating more of that type of provision.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, what Rebekah said about, was it's 3 years, within 3 years, they say that they've got to do an Ofsted inspection. What's the point? They might as well say that they're not coming, every 3 years. It's just not enough. I don't think a year's enough for children's homes. It should be every 6 months. Sorry, my light's gone off. So I don't understand the watered down regulations at all, and I don't understand why they're inspected every 3 years. You know, I think it'll probably come down to the recruitment again, not just in our sector or support accommodation, but the recruitment of Ofsted inspectors. I know there's a deficit in most parts of the country. So they haven't got the resources to inspect, but that's coming to the detriment of children